Witches. The absolutely true tale of disaster in Salem. By Roselyn Schanzer. Chapter 2. A Dire Diagnosis. Days passed, but the two girls' frightening symptoms only intensified, even though no one else in the household was getting sick. So, Reverend Paris began to wonder. Maybe the children's illness meant that God was sending him a sign. Maybe his congregation had committed some unforgivable sin and was being punished for its own good. And did the Reverend see a second sign of God's wrath? Just 1 week after the awful fits struck, and a mere 75 miles to the north in York, Maine, the Abenaki Indians and their French allies attacked, leaving the town in flames. Even babies, women, and farm animals had been slaughtered. Puritans like Reverend Paris had long believed that Indians were devils and their shamans were witches. He may have wondered if God had unleashed the destroyers to teach his subjects a lesson. Perhaps Paris had received a third sign as well, for early in February, a homeless woman named Sarah Good came knocking at Paris's door, begging for food for her baby and her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas. As Sarah Good turned to go, she muttered something under her breath. Was their gift too small? Were her words curses, the kind that caused crops to fail and livestock to die? The two afflicted girls soon seemed to get much worse. Paris thought some more and began to wonder if he himself had been the sinner. Had he been lax in his duties as a minister or as a father? Paris prayed and fasted. And so did the rest of his family. He consulted with doctors and tried dosing the girls with every elixir he could find, from parsnip seeds and wine to smelling salts made from blood, ashes, and deer antlers. Nothing worked. Then, an elderly physician named William Griggs, who had lived in Salem Village for perhaps 2 years, examined Betty and Abigail and declared that they were most certainly under an evil hand. This was the worst of all possible news because it meant that the two girls were bewitched. Dr. Griggs had good reason to think so. As early as the 1640s, about 50 years before Betty and Abigail first got sick, settlers in New England had begun to suffer from violent, life-threatening fits. Even farm animals wrestled with these convulsions. Many that seemed healthy one day could wind up dead the next. But why? Doctors couldn't find any rational explanation for the victims' bizarre contortions, nor could they explain people's visions of dark apparitions, bright lights, their temporary paralysis, their blindness and deafness, or their claims that they were being pinched, choked, bitten, scratched, sat upon, or pricked with pins. Before long, the Puritans began to look for answers in the invisible world. Was this truly some new dread disease? Or could the symptoms have been caused by witches? After all, the devil's witches could infiltrate the natural world. If such an invasion had occurred in New England, perhaps these dreadful creatures were working their magic on mere mortals, casting spells and stabbing images of victims from afar to inflict pain, staring at their prey with a poisonous, evil eye until they died. Worst yet, witches could be corrupting the innocent, who might join league with the devil by signing his book of laws just to ease their pain, or bargain away their own immortal souls in exchange for their heart's desire. That's why in 1641, 1642, and 1655, new laws in Massachusetts and Connecticut proclaimed that witchcraft was a crime punishable by death. The first so-called witch to hang was a healer from Charlestown, Massachusetts, named Margaret Jones. It was said that her mere touch could cause violent pains, deafness, and vomiting, and that she had used witchcraft to kill animals. She was tried and hanged in 1648 during an epidemic of fits. But most cases like hers were thrown out of court for lack of solid evidence, or because magistrates and ministers thought the witnesses were delusional or carried a grudge against the accused. Take the case of a New Haven, Connecticut widow named Elizabeth Godman. In 1655, she was released from jail in spite of one woman's claims that Godman was pinching her and causing dreadful fits that left her boiling hot, freezing cold, and shrieking in pain. The rash of mysterious fits never disappeared completely, and by the 1680s, rumors about this dread disease were scaring people half to death. Fear spread even farther when a popular father and son team of Boston ministers named Increase and Cotton Mather wrote several astonishing books and essays about settlers who were possessed by demons or plagued by witches. One of the most terrifying tales came from Cotton Mather's 1689 bestseller, Memorable Providences. Everyone flocked in droves to read this story, especially since Mather claimed that he had watched with his own two eyes as every detail unfolded. In the Reverend's book, 4 children from a pious Boston family were suffering from horrible fits. Their tongues would first be sucked down their own throats, then pulled out upon their chins to a prodigious length. Their jaws would snap out of joint and then clap together like a strong spring lock. They cried that they were being cut with knives and struck with blows. Their necks were broken. Their heads were twisted almost all the way around, and they would bark like dogs and roar exceedingly loud. These tortures were blamed upon a neighbor, an old Irish Catholic washerwoman named Goody Glover, who was suspected of being a witch. Before long, she was tried in court and hanged by the neck until dead. Surely Reverend Parris and Dr. Griggs knew about this famous tale. The day after Dr. Griggs presented his dire diagnosis to the Parris family, Reverend and Mrs. Parris rode off to a lecture. While they were there, they hoped to invite some neighboring ministers to join them in their home for a solemn day of prayer. But as soon as the parents left, the 2 Parris slaves, Tituba and John Indian, did something that was strictly forbidden. They knew that in New England, people used folk magic all the time to perform cures, even though Puritan ministers railed against it. There were ways to draw out witches by boiling snippets of children's hair, for example. And the 2 slaves were apparently so worried about Betty and Abigail that John Indian accepted a set of instructions from their helpful neighbor, Goodwife Mary Sibley, telling how to bake a black magic witch cake. Carefully following Sibley's recipe, Tituba and John Indian mixed some rye flour with the afflicted girl's urine, patted it into the shape of a cake, and baked it in the ashes of their fireplace. The trick was to feed this magical witch cake to a dog. Ancient European folklore alleged that dogs were the familiars of witches. This meant that dogs were actually imps, disguised as animals to help witches do their dirty work. When a dog ate a witch cake, the witch's spells were supposed to be broken. Then, the victims could reveal the witches' names for all to hear. But when Reverend Paris and his wife got home and found out about the witch cake, they were absolutely furious. Using black magic was an enormous sin. Though the two slaves were probably just trying to help, black magic could not be tolerated. Paris would later preach that Goodwife Sibley had a going to the devil for help against the devil. Betty and Abigail must have been terrified by now. Their fits and strange gibbering grew worse, and the contortions of their backs, necks, and arms were frightful to behold. Maybe Paris and his family still had not been pious enough. Paris and the neighboring ministers prayed together. He and his family fasted yet again, and he made sure that everyone in his household double their prayers again too. But the minute a prayer would end, the girls' fits began anew. So Paris and the other ministers and certain townsfolk pressed Betty and Abigail hard to reveal the witches' names. Whose evil spirits had ventured forth from the invisible world to torture them? How could the girls ever get well if the guilty witches were allowed to roam free? If these two impressionable children were convinced that witches were out to get them, who should they blame? Maybe their tormentors were the usual suspects, people their family didn't like or respect. Tituba seemed to be a logical choice. Besides making a witch cake, she was a slave, and an Indian slave at that. After all, everybody the girls knew was convinced that Indians were in league with the devil. So, Betty and Abigail declared that Tituba was a witch, and that Tituba's spirit, which was invisible to everyone else but themselves, had been pinching them and pricking them and chasing them around the room. Before long, they claimed that two other women's spirits had tortured them as well. First, Betty and Abigail remembered Sarah Good, the muttering beggar woman who had pled for food for her two young children. In Salem village, nobody liked a beggar, especially an ungrateful pipe-smoking beggar. She had to be a witch. And then they pointed the finger at a bedridden old farm woman named Sarah Osborne, whose young second husband used to be her own servant. She had not gone to church for more than a year, and rumor had it that this husband was a wife-beater. Nobody liked Osborne either, especially a certain family called the Putnams, who had fought with her for years over some land and were now leading members of Paris's church. Betty and Abigail claimed that they had seen a bird with a human head that turned into Sarah Osborne. She was obviously a despicable witch. Tituba said she loved Betty and would never have hurt her, but Reverend Paris seemed not to believe a word she said. It was time to take action. So, on February 29th, 1692, the first official complaints were filed by two Salem town magistrates, and the three accused witches were arrested. Word traveled fast. Even as the arrests were taking place, more people began to say they were tormented by fits. Almost every one of them would claim that it was witches, or the witches' spirits, that were torturing them. The first of these new accusers was a clever 12-year-old girlfriend of Betty and Abigail named Ann Putnam Jr. Ann's parents were the very strongest supporters Reverend Paris had in Salem Village. It seems that Ann was having dreadful fits, and they were all because the spirit of that beggar woman named Sarah Good was pinching her and trying to make her sign the devil's evil book. Then, A 17-year-old girl named Elizabeth Hubbard claimed she had been chased by a wolf that turned into Sarah Good and attacked by the bedridden old lady Sarah Osborne. Hubbard happened to be the niece of Dr. Griggs, the very same physician who had first blamed Betty and Abigail's fits on witchcraft. Not only did Hubbard live in Dr. Griggs' house, but she was friends with Betty and Abigail too.